So this is session 1 of what I'm simply calling the resurrection. Jesus is alive. Sometimes we tend to take this sort of very casually. He's died on Good Friday and Easter he's raised to new life. And we forget that this must have been the most amazing thing for the disciples to come to terms with. You can imagine when the others, the women came back and said, "We've seen Jesus, he's alive." They just wouldn't have believed it because it never ever happened before. And we read in Luke how when Jesus appeared in a room where they were, a room that they'd locked themselves in, it says they were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. Well, you can imagine it. It took time for it to really sink in. Yes, Jesus is alive. Now, there are many Christians today who question, was the resurrection indeed a physical thing? Or was it just that the disciples became aware that Jesus spiritually was with them, and so they wrote this story of the resurrection to explain his spiritual presence? But there's one thing that makes the story solid, and that is an empty tomb. Jesus' followers claimed he'd risen, but the Jews claimed the disciples had come and stolen the body, taken it away and hidden it somewhere, and then spread the story of a resurrection. Now, the explanation by the Jews of them stealing the body was still held 100 years later. We have the writer Justin, and who's discussing with Jews or a Jewish person. He said, "You have chosen and ordained men throughout the world to proclaim that a godless and lawless heresy had sprung from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver whom we crucified. But his disciples stole him by night out of the tomb where he was laid, when he'd been unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he's risen from the dead and ascended to heaven." Now, if the debate is still running 100 years later, then it shows that the Jewish people were very definite that Jesus had not risen, while the Christians were very definite that he had. And the fact that the debate was still raging proves one thing: the tomb must have been empty. Otherwise the Jews would simply produce a body and say, "Well, don't be ridiculous." There was something they had to explain, and that is a lack of a body. Why was it so important to the Jewish people to put over this story of the stealing the body, in other words, discounting resurrection? It shows that the resurrection is absolutely vital. If the resurrection of Jesus didn't matter, then there'd be no need to discount it. But of course it does matter. Jesus was dead for all to see. He was buried, sealed in a stone tomb. Only God could bring life out of that. And then this is God's vindication of Jesus. He was exactly who he said he was. The resurrection, God's vindication of the life of Jesus. To deny that the resurrection was an actual event is to align ourselves with the theory that the disciples stole the body and hid it. If this is so, then our faith is based on a fraud. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:17, "And if Christ had not been raised, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins." The resurrection of Jesus is absolutely central to the Christian faith, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week.
Christ is risen. See God future.